So warm welcome to everyone tuning in. We're excited to be here to discuss the Australian clinical trials landscape and the ecosystem behind it, supporting the early phase, in particular, the phase 1 for global biotechs. So this webinar aims to inform international biotechs that are either coming out of preclinical and going into their first phase 1, or any biotech globally that would like to uncover more about the Australian landscape. On the webinar today, we have a range of highly reputable service providers that can support the end-to-end activity for any biotech looking to perform a phase 1 program in Australia. Some introductions here. Let's start off with Kurt Sales.
Thanks very much, Dan. So hello, everybody. I'm Kurt Sales. I'm the Chief Scientific Officer for Agilex Biolabs. Agilex is Australia's largest GLP toxicology and bioanalytical laboratory. Our role really primarily is to support IND-enabling GLP toxicology packages, as well as support the bioanalytical component of a clinical trial in Australia. My role as Chief Scientific Officer is to try and understand the drug compound and how Agilex as a company would then support your bioanalytical component of your clinical trial. Thank you.
Thanks, Kurt. My name's Daniel Evans. I'm the Director of Business Development at Southern Star Research. We're a full-service CRO based in Sydney, but we operate across the Australian, New Zealand and APAC regions. We support early phase biotechs with end-to-end clinical development, all the way from medical writing, site liaison, vendor management, project management of your study, safety and medical monitoring, the clinical monitoring for your program, and all onshore biostatistics and data management. We specialize in phase 1 studies, but we can also support your later programs. Thank you very much. Chris Hickey.
Thanks, Dan. Hey, everybody. My name is Chris Hickey. I'm the Chief Business Development Officer for Nucleus Network, and we are one of the world's largest providers of early phase clinical trial execution with expertise in first-in-human clinical pharmacology study types such as DDI, TQT, and food effect, and a specialty service in renal and hepatic impairment. And we do that currently between two major regions where large majority of the international phase 1 studies are conducted in Australia, of course, and also in the United States. I work with our team in the field to make sure that our sponsors get access to all of the experts and guidance and support that they need in order to plan, execute, and deliver the clinical data that's needed in order to continue development of a variety of assets, both small and large molecules, in the early phase space. And looking forward to our conversation today. Thanks, Dan.
Thanks, Chris. And Mike?
Thanks, Dan. So, hi, I'm Mike Burfield, and I run a company called RDI Partners, and we're a team of accountants, bioscientists, and tax people that come together to deliver a one-stop shop of services that enable non-Australian groups to establish a presence in Australia, conduct clinical development work, and make use of the R&D incentive. We're a one-stop shop, so we kind of do everything from setting up the company, providing Australian resident director work, structuring the arrangement, transfer pricing work, R&D tax work, and ostensibly everything you need to operate that subsidiary in Australia. We've been doing this for a long time, and there's really nothing that we have not come across or dealt with in all aspects of these transactions.
Thank you, Mike. And might pass to Mike from Sendia.
Hi there. My name is Mike Mulcahy. I'm Chief Business Officer of Sendia. Sendia is a therapeutic product development and regulatory consultancy providing strategy and implementation support for therapeutic product development with a focus on US FDA, EMA, MHRA, and of course Australia. And through our Australian office, we help support people to navigate the regulatory requirements in Australia, but also feed into how that is used globally as part of an overall strategy. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. And finally, we have Joe from IDT Australia.
Thanks, Dan. I'm Joe Nevis. I'm the Commercial Partnerships Manager for IDT. IDT is a contract and development manufacturing organisation. We have a multitude of pillars. So we manufacture small molecule APIs from milligrams up to commercial scale, first in human, right through to commercial. We do specialty orals, anything by mouth. So that would include capsules, tablets, and non-sterile liquids. And then we have an advanced therapies pillar, which we manufacture sterile liquids and lyophilized powders as well. IDT was the first company to manufacture an mRNA compound in the Southern Hemisphere. And we can do all your clinical labeling and packaging. Thanks for your time.
Thank you, Joe. So there we have it, the turnkey service providers for Australian early phase. Just want to set the scene in terms of some of the background to Australian clinical success and some facts that you might not know about Australia in terms of reputation and success stories that we've had. So in terms of world-class reputation, we're recognised as a leading destination for clinical trials, particularly in the early phase. It's validated by the acceptance of our data by the FDA, the EMA, and many other regulatory bodies. Australia is also a hub for innovation. We've got some of the world-leading sites for performing innovative programs and development of clinical assets, such as the Peter MacCallum Cancer Centre in Melbourne, Chris O'Brien Lifehouse in Sydney, and Telethon Kids Institute, for example, from a paediatric perspective in Perth. In terms of our population, it's very ethnically diverse. It's quite reflective of the United States population in terms of its Anglo-European heritage. But we also have a large diaspora of Southeast Asian and South Asian populations, and it makes studies like Japanese ethnic studies available to do here as well. So in terms of success stories in Australia, we've recently had a success story of Keytruda. So Keytruda, which is a blockbuster drug from Merck. The first phase 1 study was conducted here in Australia. The HPV vaccine was developed in Queensland and has become a global success, saving many, many lives with cancer. So very, very successful stories there. And we also have CSL, obviously, providing vaccine and therapeutics for global markets also. In terms of some of the data around early phase supporting Australia as a leader, as you can see on the table there for phase 1, Australia overtook the UK quite recently and has become the third biggest provider of phase 1 services in the world, just behind the United States and China. And our population is 27 million, so very, very good indeed in terms of a per capita basis. I might hand over to Chris Hickey to discuss this slide in terms of the timelines, approval process, and also the cost to actually get the study into the clinic from a document point of view, and also submitting your study to our regulator and our HREC process. Chris?
Thanks, Dan. Yeah, so as we'll hear a little bit later in the webinar here, there's a variety of reasons why Australia is a really amazing place for clinical trial execution. This is probably one of the most powerful ones, and the reason that a lot of our international biopharma sponsors select Australia and the groups here represented today to execute on their clinical trial development plans in the early phase space. And so, you know, comparing it to the US FDA IND is always a good basis of comparison. That's mostly well known. I know we've got some questions on that here in a little bit. But importantly, the process for starting a study in Australia is relatively straightforward and quite easy, but not any less robust than what it would be expected of other international jurisdictions, which gets to the point of being able to use this data for continued drug development globally. And we'll talk about the reason for that here in a little bit. But from a process perspective, the reason that it's easier and faster is outlined here on these slides. There's It's really a two-step process. First is the HREC submission, or Human Research Ethics Committee submission, which really only requires 3 essential documents, plus a few other pieces of information that sites and the CROs you work with will help to prepare and submit. But the 3 key documents are all study specific and include your clinical protocol, your investigator's brochure, and your informed consent form. With those 3 documents, that's the essential documents that are needed for submission to the HREC, which is done by the principal investigator at the site that you're intending to work with. And so there's no need for an IND. There's no need for a CMC dossier or equivalent. There's no need for send data sets to be submitted to the ethics committee in Australia. And for those reasons, that's why the submission process is actually much more straightforward than it would be relative to other jurisdictions. The second step in that process, after approval at the ethics committee level, which will review both the scientific and the ethical parts of conducting a clinical program in Australia, is to do what's called a clinical trial notification to the TGA, the Therapeutic Goods Administration of Australia, which is where you essentially are sharing with the TGA that you've received and will be starting a clinical trial that's been approved by the assigned ethics committee in Australia. And once those 2 pieces are in place, you're in a position where you can start your study. So the speed part that comes with this isn't necessarily the review cycle, because it's not any less robust than what it would be otherwise. It's where you can start your study. So what our chief medical officer will often say is, once our sponsors are confident in the outcomes of the GLP toxicology studies to support a starting dose calculation and safety assessments and study design in a clinical program, prepare and finalize your investigator's brochure, and then use those documents for submission to the ethics committee. So it isn't that we're taking any shortcuts, because we're a GCP ICH compliant region and have been for many, many years, which is the reason why we can deliver really high quality data in support of ongoing clinical trial execution plans. Is that we can start faster, and then we basically execute on a similar trajectory to what a first in human study would look like in other regions. The regulatory pathway is similar once you submit to the United States, and then the study will really move as quickly as what the protocol will allow, which now in today's globalized environment, between the primary regions where these first in human study types are conducted, are obviously very similar from one to the next in terms of timing. So being able to start faster is, in a highly competitive biotech, biopharma world today, is a massive advantage. Every day really counts, and when you could potentially save anywhere from 3 to 6 months by starting earlier following the Australian regulatory cycle, adds huge benefit and value to an individual asset and a company that's running and managing these studies in Australia, with highly reputable providers and high degree of confidence that the data you're going to get from that delivers on the objectives of the study, but importantly also delivers for the biotech management team and investors, and most importantly, the patients that are waiting as well. Dan, I'll turn it back to you.
Excellent. Great summary, Chris. And just moving on from that, we've all recently attended the JP Morgan conference in San Francisco. And one of the main trends and topics that came up, certainly from our perspective, was from biotechs. Why would we come to Australia is the initial question. Why would we move our study from North America or Europe, wherever the asset sits, all the way 10,000 miles away to Australia? It's very far away. Won't time zones be an issue? All these different trends came through, and the proof is in the pudding that many biotechs do come here, and it's the reason why we are third in the world for phase 1 programs. And it essentially comes down to these 3 pillars here that support early phase success for biotechs, which encompasses quality, speed, and cost efficiency. And those three together, essentially for biotechs that have faced a very difficult capital markets time in the past several years, really do support and stretch those dollars further, as well as allow you to get your data earlier as well. So I might start off with a few questions from the webinar delegation today. And I might start with Kurt from Agilex Biolabs to discuss quality. And one of the questions that kept coming up at JPM, Kurt, was, will our data be accepted overseas? And what is the actual quality of Australian data? How robust is it in comparison to, say, the United States or a European country, for example?
An excellent question. Thanks, Dan. And one that we do get time and time again. Data generated out of Australia is second to none globally. We have world-class phase 1 units, clinicians, principal investigators, each leaders in their own specific therapeutic indication or field. We've got Nobel laureates within Australia and within Australian research environment. So that in itself speaks to quality of the type of research environment and data that that Australia can produce. If we delve down a little bit more deeply into the actual running of clinical trials, laboratories that generate data, either the laboratories that are generating the safety data that are ISO accredited in 15189, for example, or those laboratories like Agilex Biolabs that offer services under the principles of OECD GLP and ISO 17025. The quality management systems really underpin all of the data that's generated out of these various institutions, and cumulatively that data is then the data used to report the safety and efficacy, pharmacokinetics and pharmacodynamics associated with the clinical trial. And data generated more recently has shown that upwards of 50% of new IND filings submitted to the FDA contain data originating from clinical trials in Australia. So we've been doing this for almost 3 decades now, and it's a really well-trodden path, and there's no compromise in data. So yes, the data is accepted globally at all of the regulatory agencies. Each regulatory agency might have certain nuances. So as a company, we always ask the question to the client as to where they intend lodging or filing the data for their investigational new drug, so that we can ensure that if there are any bioanalytical nuances that we need to tweak in terms of how we validate an assay, bearing in mind that we validate to the global standards, the latest standards such as the RCH M10, that we have all of those little nuances written into our validation plans to ensure that that there is no compromise in the data being accepted by those regulatory agencies.
Excellent. Thank you, Kurt. And just moving on to the speed element of Australian early phase studies. Another thing that kept coming up at JPM was in terms of biotech executives asking us at our meetings was they were looking to start their clinical study in a specific month of 2025 or 2026. And they wanted to understand what was on the critical path to allow them to achieve that and what can be done to de-risk their delivery of that program in Australia.
Hey, Dan, this is Chris. I might jump in and tackle that. Yeah, we received that question quite a few times, actually, from biotech executives who are entering 2025, and really even more so than prior years, which has always kind of been the case, but even more so this year, is tasked with ensuring delivery of their portfolios and certain assets within that portfolio to deliver for the marketplace and for the investor. And as I shared earlier with the patients that are waiting for really new, amazing medicines as well. And so Australia is and continues to be looked at for the reasons we're talking about and discussing today, as a region to help assure that delivery. And from a critical path perspective, as we talked about earlier, understanding how that program fits into the regulatory approval cycle within the Australia region using the HREC and CTN pathway is really important. And so making sure that the 3 essential documents that we talked about earlier are on track and are unavailable, most notably the finalization of the investigator's brochure and clinical protocol, to really maximize the utility of the region by speeding up delivery of that HREC submission, is the best way to manage and de-risk the delivery of a early phase clinical asset in a human clinical setting. And so in terms of, specific months, obviously, having somebody ask you in January if you could be dosing in June is certainly feasible in Australia, which it might not always necessarily be the case in other regions where a more onerous preparation and delivery cycle is at times necessary to support that type of program. So what we're seeing is, we've been coming out of a little bit of the biotech winter over the last couple of years. The data is pretty clear. There's more money going to fewer biotechs, and it's going to those ones with really good teams, really good data, and a really good strategy for execution. And using the Australia platform and providers that can facilitate the delivery of that is a really amazing way to de-risk the delivery of programs in 2025 and obviously into future years as well. And so the emergence of using Australia as more of a strategic play versus a simple transactional one is becoming much more commonplace with incredibly successful biotechs and pharmaceutical companies who continue to look to Australia for really amazing, high quality data, faster, and as we'll come to learn out here in a second, a little bit cheaper than other regions as well. Thanks, Dan.
Can I just add a point to that as well? The Australia piece of this is usually incorporated into the overall strategy for product development. So often when we're helping clients to develop and strategize, Australia is the first part of the overall strategy, but the data is then taken and used for, to address other regulatory regions. Usually US FDA is the primary region that everyone is targeting. But of course, using Australian data in order to realize that can accelerate, the strategy beyond Australia as well. So you've got the speed to get set up, but then you have your first in human data, and you can take that elsewhere to continue with momentum in your program ahead of your competitors. So that's very attractive on a whole number of fronts: investors, patients, everybody.
Yeah, agreed. It certainly allows you to leapfrog into the US very quickly. And one other question that we do get as well is around the manufacturing side and the development of the clinical batches. So I've got a question for Joe from IDT Australia, just in relation to a theme that often comes up at these conferences, and we get asked a lot in client calls as well, is in terms of the GMP aspect. So for phase 1 clinical studies, we often hear that you don't require GMP or full GMP for those clinical batches. Can you elaborate on that and also advise us on what is allowed and what is permissible at the phase 1 level?
Thanks, Dan. Look, this is obviously a fairly big question in terms of what's required for phase 1 and early first in human trials. The different jurisdictions have different regulations in terms of the GMP requirements, but they are pretty consistent, and essentially they're around ensuring patient safety and patient efficacy. What a lot of the regulations talk to is quality by design, and a risk-based approach or stage-gated approach to manufacturing. So for your early phase, your tox, your early phase clinical and first in human, a lower level of GMP compliance is required when compared to when you're going into a commercial footing. So you build the dossier as you go through the various stages of clinical development. In terms of, so what you often hear is GMP-like. That is not something that is generally used within the regulations, but it is something that most CDMOs can accommodate in their work. But I think that's probably enough on that one.
Thank you, Joe. And Mike from Sendia, in relation to what we've heard in the previous slide, in terms of the Australian regulatory notification scheme and also the HREC submission, how does the Australian regulatory scheme differ from, say, the United States or a country in Europe, for example?
Yeah, I mean, a great question. We've sort of gone over this a couple of times in the presentation so far already, in the context of what Chris was talking about and what we were talking about. It's a much simplified process. Essentially, there's you apply to the Human Ethics Committee to get approval for your clinical study, and then you do a clinical trial notification to the TGA. So it's a much shorter process, 4 to 6 weeks to get your ethics approval, and then it's a really quick 24-hour process to get your clinical trial notification set up. And that really is a massive advantage in terms of simplified process, getting a quick setup to actually start your clinical study. In other regions, US and Europe, it's a much more complicated either IND or CTA process. So it takes that little bit longer, and it also costs a little bit more depending on what kind of organization you are. So that there's a big speed advantage. And then again, coming back to what we touched earlier, usually people factor Australian data into their overall clinical strategy and their product development strategy, again, to try and accelerate achievement of certain milestones towards satisfying investors and getting medicines to patients.
Excellent. Thanks, Mike. And moving on to the cost efficiency, which I know is going to be quite important to biotechs out there, as Chris alluded to the recent biotech winter and the really strenuous capital markets outlay over the past few years. So I might hand over to Mike Burfield at RDI Partners to discuss some of the cost efficiency aspects of Australian clinical trials and how you can set up your organization in Australia to take full advantage of the R&D refund that's available here.
Awesome, Dan. Thanks for that. So my part in the ecosystem is around enabling you to take advantage of the cost advantage. Take advantage of the cost advantage is beauty, right? The one part of this is the R&D tax incentive. Now, naturally, there are a number of other elements that contribute to the cost advantage, but my specialisation is R&D tax. As I travel around the place, I hear a lot of people talking about the R&D incentive as a rebate, a magical rebate. It's not that. It's a tax program where the benefit is delivered through the Australian tax system and works through a structure of enabling eligible expenditure incurred on eligible activities to be through eligible entities that enable them to effectively cash out tax losses at the rate of 43.5% of their R&D spend. So in essence, it's a refundable tax offset or a tax refund. It's very similar in principle to the UK R&D program. So I find in dealing with friends from the UK, there's a much better fundamental understanding of how this program works and what it is. The incentive is extremely transparent, and it's a rules-based program that's been around for nearly 40 years in various forms. So in this webinar this morning, I've got to be particularly brief, so I'll just break it down for you a little. We talked about eligible expenditure incurred on eligible activities by eligible entities. So basically, an eligible entity is for these types of transactions is typically a wholly owned subsidiary of the foreign parent company or the non-Australian company. Super important here for the eligibility of the refundable stream of the R&D incentive is that the company group must have a turnover of less than 20 million Australian dollars. And this can be sometimes quite complex because group includes entities that control the parent entity or whom the parent entity controls, where direct control is typically 40% or more, but in terms of ownership, but there are also some more indirect control or affiliation rules that we also need to consider. Eligible activities are basically so simple in the clinical space because this R&D program is an industry broad program. Someone developing a computer program that suits those rules of experimental development is equally as eligible at law as someone undertaking a clinical trial. Hypothesis-driven experimentation. So much so does the clinical dev space fit into this program that they created clinical trial determination. So companies that are undertaking a phase 1, 2, 3, 4 clinical trial on an unregulated therapeutic with a clinical trial notification number, it is determined to be eligible. So you can put one risk factor behind you immediately, that is, what if we go through this whole process and the government determines that we're ineligible? When it comes to clinical dev, they just simply won't. Now, eligible expenditure is expenditure that is incurred on the activity. The expenditure was necessary for the activity to take place, right? There are nuances, but we'll take that offline. R&D registrations, the program works through the development of an R&D registration that is prepared and lodged annually, and the benefit crystallises through the lodgement of the corporate tax return of that Australian company. Typically, we see R&D refunds take around 4 to 6 weeks of lodgement of the tax return, right? So it's a pretty fast turnaround. You have to set up an Australian entity, and setting up an entity is easy. All we really need to know is what you want to call it, and who the shareholder is, and what the shareholder's address is. Importantly, we need the Australian entity to act as the sponsor of the clinical work and to be established prior to the execution of agreements with Australian vendors. Right. The setup process is quick. It literally takes a couple of hours, but it takes a good 60 days to secure an Australian business number, onboard foreign directors, and open a bank account. There are always nuances in this program, and I would always invite anyone to contact me directly and we can talk through it. It is not a complex issue. It's about doing things properly. Thanks, Dan.
Excellent, Mike. Thank you for that summary. That brings me to our final slide, which essentially is a wrap-up of the webinar. We hope that today's session has provided you with some more insight into the Australian clinical development landscape and answered any potential last questions that you've had in terms of the Australian early phase ecosystem here, and also the potential service providers to enable you to conduct that clinical study here in Australia. So thank you everyone for tuning in, and please reach out